Here's where I want to go with this on Apple. Can we start with Apple? And I don't know if Apple is the least of our worries, if you will, but that's your sense, is that Apple is not really on the radar here.
Well, it is a lower priority, right? If there are investigations that are being built, it's Google and Facebook first.
Google and Facebook first, but I'm starting
Is that because of privacy, or why do you think that is? Why? Because Apple doesn't have the same privacy concerns?
Well, it's because of antitrust. I mean, there are antitrust investigations, so those are the ones that people are screaming loudest about. So
walk us through the permutations in terms of what you think happens next, to the extent that we're going to model off of history and look at the former investigations that the FTC pursued into Google, into Facebook. What happens? How long a process are we talking about here?
I mean, it could be a very long process. Right. I mean, if we're looking at history, we should look at the Microsoft case, right? And any of those previous cases were a decade long at least. So everyone should just, pop their popcorn because it's going to take a long time. And I think it's very likely that Google could be first. You think Google's first, and you think that there actually is going to be a case? There is no case open yet, right? This is just a jurisdictional shift.
Right, we haven't even had the investigation part yet.
Right, exactly. But we've been listening to a lot of complaints coming out of D.C., and we know for sure that the Justice Department is actively mulling these questions of, does Google have an inappropriate sway in the online advertising market? How do you define the market? They're really struggling with that. I mean, very publicly, Maykan Delrahim was asking these questions. So here's my question to you. If you think about the companies that are going to come out and try to testify against Google, let's make the list. Who's on? But that's how this works, by the way. In fact, Mark Andreessen was on the other end of the Microsoft case at Netscape, and what you had was a number of powerful but smaller companies basically make the case that this was a monopoly. Yes. So there have been companies that have been public already. Right. We've seen Oracle and News Corp, my employer in Australia, be really public about what their complaints have been. So we can assume similar complaints are going to be made in the U.S. Yelp, of course, has been a very loud complainer for years about this. And, as we reported over the weekend, there have been more than a dozen companies that have come down to the FTC and made these kind of complaints over the last few years. And in terms of structure, if there was a structural remedy, because that is what Maykan typically likes. I mean, that's what he talks about liking. But by the way, unclear whether Maykan will still be in this role if we're talking about this being a decade-long process. So the question I'd ask is, if today you could wave a magic wand and change the structure, what would you do? Well, everyone says what you would begin by doing, of course, is saying you can't buy any more stuff. Right, so let's start there. And then if you need to spin out things, maybe you spin out YouTube. Maybe the third-party ad business has to be separated from the search business. These are some of the things that people have talked about. Scott, what would you do? Or would you?
I wouldn't, but
you wouldn't.
I think there's activity. I think there's probably behavioral changes short of spinning things out. Right. So yes, obviously the Yelp scenario that you described obviously was a real scenario, and so I think there's probably behavioral changes you can make to prevent that type of stuff happening in the future. But I agree with what you said, which is in the short term, I think what we know is M&A basically is off the table for most of these companies. Anything.
For most of those companies, does that spread to beyond just those 4 companies that are named? Are there other big companies that are not going to be able to be buying things because the tide has just turned against big companies in general?
My personal view is, look, I think there'll be more scrutiny of these things, but I don't know if there's anybody else who rises to the level of those 4. I don't know if you have a different view, but
I agree. Although reading the press this morning, I did think Netflix must be mopping its brow somewhere in a corner, but it's right. in a slightly different category. Okay, but you made the point. We were talking about China earlier. Yeah. And this goes to the larger point that I think you're trying to make, which is if you try to slow down the success of an Amazon, a Facebook, a Google, you're still going to be competing against an Alibaba, a Tencent, and companies that effectively will get even bigger.
I think that's right.
This goes back. This is sort of the argument, by the way, that the banks made post too big to fail, post crisis, right. That they needed to remain of size and scale because they needed to compete against these international behemoths.
And what's happened? Look, I mean, Dodd-Frank in some respects has been the greatest beneficiary. Those banks have been huge beneficiaries of Dodd-Frank, right? It's basically kept out competition, particularly in the U.S. Yeah, I think the bigger question is exactly what we said, which is, look, do we want to have an environment here that's favorable towards entrepreneurship and economic growth and job development? And we should clearly stop behavior that's illegal. There's no question about that from an antitrust perspective. But I do think the bigger question here is, look, capital is free-flowing. All this technology is free-flowing. And the more we do to make it more difficult to operate here, the more likely
it is. You just use Microsoft. I mean, Microsoft, it was about behavior, about making them change things.
Yeah, but there was
because of that long investigation,
Right.
Andrew made the point yesterday, and I think it's true. Yeah. Microsoft fell behind in a lot of different areas as a result.
Right. And there was very clear conduct in the Microsoft case, right? There was this very clear, at least an allegation, that they were tying things together, which
I've heard the same arguments made about
Google for sure, right? I mean, that's the bundling is like the key issue.
Yeah, I think that's a real question, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so many people have compared those cases.
How does this change? And I think Becky was trying to get to this earlier. Your investment thesis about buying into certain companies early that I think historically you would have said to yourself, okay, we have this great environment because we can get bought by Google, we can get bought by Facebook, we can get bought by Amazon. But now if you think they are not going to be in the acquisition game, how does that change the whole sort of Sand Hill Road story?
I don't think it changes it that much, to be honest, because our whole default when we go into these companies is we have to believe they can ultimately become standalone IPO-able businesses. Now, we're wrong a lot of the times.
You got to admit, there's a little bit of a maybe additional margin you give them to think, okay,
I think that's probably right. I mean, look, we were investors in Oculus, right? That was acquired by Facebook, and we didn't go in there thinking that was the case. But look, had it been a standalone company, we knew there was a lot of capital raising that would have to be done. So, yeah, I think every now and then you get these companies.
But I guess the point is, does everybody go to a Monday morning meeting at Andreessen Horowitz and say, you know what, guys, the big four are now off the table in terms of being our
yes, I think we have a very,
saviors.
Yeah, it's not a discussion at our Monday morning meetings, but yes, I think we all have a very clear view that it's unlikely that there's going to be room for these folks to be able to do any major acquisitions. It's also the case that we go into our Monday meetings and say anyone who's relying on these companies for customer acquisition, that's a good short-term strategy, but long-term, you have to develop organic methods of customer acquisition.
Oh, that's interesting. So how do you do that organically? Because I think everybody's gotten so lazy because they just fall back on these ways for customer acquisition.
Well, I mean, it goes to the fundamental of some of these businesses. If you have network effect businesses or businesses that have virality, right, where kind of one customer effectively can attract others, it really just forces us to kind of raise the bar on how we scrutinize kind of what the long-term acquisition plans are for these companies.